Hi, I'm Brandy Bergenstock, and we're going to talk about the global classroom. We're talking about this because we have a 21st century world, and we're not just teaching our own kids. We're teaching everybody, and everybody's helping us teach them. I get quite a few physics lessons from Toys from Trash by Arvind Gupta in India. I go to his site and I get a lot of stuff, and we all teach each other. This particular image here is my own image of diversity in the classroom. You have gifted students, students on the spectrum, bilingual students. You want students to celebrate these diversities. Of all the images on the end, though, only the question mark is for the teacher. This question mark asks us to question our own assumptions and expectations for our students and to make sure that we're the first voice and the line for equality and justice in our classrooms. That's going to create a welcoming classroom. So what are some other ways besides this lofty idea of creating equality? How can we do that? Well, the very first thing is learn people's names. Learn to pronounce it correctly, even if it's not in a language you understand or it's not a name you've ever heard before. Everyone wants their own identity celebrated. And this goes into some of our students who might have two languages. Labeling object, especially specific subject objects like flasks or funnels, things that would only be in a science room or a math room. Label it in both languages. That can help the students who are trying to learn that language. Maybe there's Japanese in your school, maybe there's Spanish. Creating a visual schedule is not only good for your second language learners, but also kids on a spectrum. The easiest way I find to create a really welcoming classroom is to have that population represented in my PowerPoints. I cannot overestimate the creation of cohesion of a group when everyone feels seen and heard. And when we're speaking to our students, we're going to want to be very careful about our assumptions about knowledge or their abilities. Avoid things like, well, everyone can or everyone has, because everyone doesn't. So when we have second language learners, invite their cultures in the classroom. That whole experience of sharing and learning creates a lot of shared memories and unity within a group. And this goes to the next concept of celebrate our differences, not just the things that make us homogeneous, like being the same grade or same age, but celebrating our differences is a beautiful thing. Gifted students often get overlooked in a welcoming classroom because we're busy working with children on the spectrum or special ed or English language. But gifted students really want to have a voice too. Boredom is a real challenge for them. So making sure that our classrooms are welcoming and honoring their intellectual gifts is very important. And we have socioeconomic differences. Even above and beyond all these other things, we're going to have challenges with money. Always emphasize abilities and not tools. Say they tried really hard. Compliment their punctuality. Really try not to comment on certain kids' clothes because it creates a preference for kids that can't afford it. So we're going to talk about poverty in students because this has a huge effect. And frankly, it really affects everyone. If we look at this chart right here, we can see that there's not an ethnicity of people that are not affected by poverty in America. But when we look at the numbers, we've got about 16% of kids living in poverty at some point in their life, between birth and 15. If you take into effect that in 2009 or 2018, the poverty level was $25,000, but research shows that you need twice that to cover basic expenses, the number really gets closer to 39% of kids that will live in poverty at some point in their life. So 1/3 of your class is going to be affected statistically by poverty. And so that's something that we really want to pay attention to. And why would that matter? So we've got books, we give them books, we've got education. Why would poverty matter? Because what we find is that children that grow up in poverty stay in poverty. Only a very tiny fraction of adults who've never experienced poverty in childhood were poor in their 20s and 30s. While we see over here that children that experience poverty stayed in poverty. We need to understand how that affects our students. And it starts with strategies that don't necessarily treat it, but make us aware of how to go about talking to our students. And the very first one that I want to talk about is obviously respect. Whether you come from middle class or upper class, we all have the same ability to achieve. And students really need to feel respected regardless of their parental socioeconomics. And this goes directly into the second one, which is expect your students to achieve. It's very important to instill that higher education is possible for them, that they know that someone believes in them too. And just because they're poor doesn't mean that you're going to expect less from them or that they're allowed to give less. This last one here is pretty important to me. You want to make sure that the homework you're giving, the projects you're giving, aren't keeping some of your students from doing it. I got a failing grade in a class one time because the teacher had weighted a project really, really heavily in first grade, and I couldn't do it. I didn't even ask my mom for the supplies because we had food insecurities at the time. We had clothing insecurities. I certainly wasn't going to ask her to buy this backboard and supplies that the teacher had told me. And so I failed. In fact, there were times I didn't even turn in homework, and I would tell her, I don't have any paper. I don't own a pencil. And she would just tell me I was lying. So be aware of how poverty can affect your students. Reach out to families. Sometimes that means going to the siblings because you're not always going to be able to call your parents who have economic challenges and struggles. I'm going to skip these two because they're obvious. The last one is don't underestimate your influence on your student. In James Garvino's book, Raising Kids in a Socially Toxic Environment, that talks about ways people were able to mitigate negative circumstances in their lives, the number one most likely source, even about religious figures, was teachers helping students overcome difficult years. So you matter a lot. Thank you so much. I hope you took away a couple strategies and how to understand poverty and how it affects your students.